faithfully delivering value by interpreting great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally with Book Talks. Today we're introducing a renowned political philosophy book from the late 17th century, and John Locke's two treatises of government. Before diving into Locke's work, let's set the stage with a piece of British history. In 1640, King Charles I reconvened the parliament he dissolved to fund his war against Scottish rebels, raising taxes on landowners and the middle class.
No surprise, the MPs fiercely opposed it.
Charles I's heavy-handed taxes led them to demand limits on royal power, so he couldn't manipulate Parliament at will. With Parliament being summoned and disbanded on a whim, they hit a stalemate. By 1642, civil war had erupted between the two sides. Over the next 50 years, from 1642 to 1689, Britain saw a whirlwind of regime changes. After civil war broke out, Charles I was executed. Cromwell, leader of the parliamentarians, established a republic. After Cromwell died, the republic fell. Charles I's sons reclaimed the throne, and the Stuart Restoration lasted nearly 30 years. In 1688, a coup d'etat ousted King James II, and Parliament installed his daughter and son-in-law. This became known as the Glorious Revolution. Then in 1789, Britain enacted a bill stating no taxes without Parliament's approval. Plus, the king couldn't scrap laws or block their enforcement. This is the famous Bill of Rights. For the first time, it put Parliament's power above the king's. This kicked off Britain's constitutional monarchy, still in place today. Fascinatingly, just 2 months after the Bill of Rights, a groundbreaking book emerged, echoing its principles. That book is Locke's Two Treatises of Government, our focus today. The book was deeply shaped by the entire English Revolution. Amid the revolution's chaos, with rulers changing, thinkers had to ponder politics' core, how to legitimize governance. Without solving this, neither royalists nor parliamentarians could hold power steadily. And John Locke was one of the thinkers who participated in these discussions. In 1632, Locke was born into a British lawyer's family and had been a top student since his youth. After completing his education at the prestigious Westminster School, he entered Oxford University. Although Locke excelled academically, he found the Christian theology at university rather boring, so he turned to medicine and natural sciences, joining a small academic group of scientists. Through the Royal Society, Locke happened to perform surgery on the Earl of Shaftesbury, becoming his secretary and thus entering politics. This Earl of Shaftesbury was a staunch opponent of the Royalists, and Locke's political views were greatly influenced by him. In 1682, the Earl of Shaftesbury became deeply embroiled in a political scandal in England. To avoid risks, Locke, as his advisor, followed the Earl to the Netherlands. Though living abroad, Locke remained productive. During this period, he completed many important works like an essay concerning human understanding and a letter concerning toleration. Only after the Glorious Revolution concluded and Britain's political situation stabilized did he return home. Notably, Locke's Two Treatises of Government also took final form during his exile. The two treatises consists of 2 parts. Actually, the second treatise was mostly completed in the 1670s, while the first was written later. In the first treatise, Locke focused entirely on refutation. Specifically, he refuted a 1068 book titled Patriarcha, while his own political theories are fully developed in the second treatise. The entire 2 treatises addresses 3 fundamental questions. First, how did government originate? Second, what are the limits of governmental power? Finally, how should governmental powers be structured? Now, some might ask, since Locke finished the second treatise earlier, why didn't he publish it directly instead of adding a first treatise to critique another work? This is because Patriarcha carried enormous significance at that time. Its author was Sir Robert Filmer, a prominent royalist figure of the era. Scholars believe Patriarcha was actually written before 1642. Filmer intended to dedicate it to Charles I, but the outbreak of the English Civil War delayed its publication until 1680. Coincidentally, this period was the Stuart Restoration, when Charles I's son sought to rebuild absolute monarchy. Thus, Filmer's book provided theoretical support for traditional monarchical rule. Essentially, the book centers on two core arguments. First, Filmer believed a king's rule over subjects is as natural as a father's rule over children. Filmer stated that children must obey fathers who control their property and arrange marriages. Self-evident truths. Similarly, he claimed this applies to the relationship between people and their king. Second, royal authority traces back to Adam, the first human. Filmer argued that according to the Bible, God created Adam and granted him dominion over all creation. Thus, Adam's descendants, kings through history, inherited this dominion.
Therefore, kings could tax subjects freely since
Every inch of the land belongs to the crown. However, Locke saw serious flaws in Filmer's work, including biblical misinterpretations. With solid theological grounding, Locke offered alternative scriptural interpretations. We won't detail Locke's line-by-line rebuttals here. Broadly, Locke contended the Bible grants Adam stewardship, not political dominion. Moreover, Scripture confirms this gift was for all humanity, not Adam alone. Thus, claiming Adam had political dominion is utter nonsense. Even if Adam had such authority, after millennia, who could prove descent from him? Actually, Locke found Filmer's premise of inherent human subjugation most unacceptable. In contrast, Locke's theory asserts humans are born free, with governing authority emerging through social development. And from this perspective, Locke systematically explains how human governments actually emerged. At the start of the second treatise, Locke proposes his famous state of nature theory. He believed that before governments existed, humans lived in a state of nature with three key characteristics. First, everyone was equal. What does this mean? Locke didn't deny physical or intellectual differences between people. But it doesn't mean, if I'm taller, I can rule over you.
or that if I'm smarter, you must treat me as your king.
In the state of nature, no one needed to obey anyone's commands.
Second, everyone was free, controlling only themselves. To survive, you could freely use your body to find food and clothing without others' consent, your inherent right.
However, even without government, people weren't lawless. Locke believed natural law existed in this state, discoverable through reason and binding on all. The third characteristic. Natural law mandates self-preservation. Protecting life, health, liberty, and property are inherent natural rights. It also requires that, while ensuring your survival, you mustn't harm others. For example, hunger doesn't justify stealing food. Natural law forbids it. With natural law, the best approach was peaceful coexistence, living your life without conflict. We see Locke countered Filmer's natural rulers theory with his state of nature hypothesis, arguing history began with universal equality. But this brought Locke face to face with a stronger opponent, English philosopher Hobbes. For Britons then, state of nature immediately evoked Hobbes's famous work. In Leviathan, Hobbes also envisioned a pre-government state of nature with universal equality, but he believed humans there constantly fought each other for self-preservation. He famously described it as man as a wolf to man. To end this mutual slaughter and establish order, Hobbes called for a strongest ruler, even an absolute monarch, to take charge, granting him absolute power. Except for this ruler, no one else in society could harm each other. But this strongest ruler is the sovereign, or the government. Thus Locke's question, if the state of nature is so peaceful, unlike Hobbes's warring vision, why do humans need government at all? Locke's answer, the state of nature itself is good, allowing peaceful coexistence. But three fatal flaws in natural law compel people to form societies. First, natural law isn't codified in black and white. Though existing as a rule, it's intangible and invisible. Simply put, it relies on individual conscience. Without clear statutes, conflicting interpretations cause disputes. Second, there's no impartial judge to determine violations of natural law. When personal interests are involved, people struggled to be objective. For example, if Zhang attacks Li, Li would naturally seek revenge. But while avenging, Li might claim emotional damages and seize Zhang's cattle. Would this violate Zhang's rights? Without an arbitrator, no one can say definitively in the state of nature. Third, even with correct judgments under natural law, there's no enforcement power. In theory, everyone in the state of nature can enforce natural law. It's reciprocity, you hit me, I hit back, but if the attacker is stronger, the victim suffers helplessly. Physical weakness prevents self-enforcement against aggressors. The solution: everyone consents to delegate enforcement power to a neutral third party for judgment and punishment. This transition marks the end of the state of nature and birth of civil society. That third party, entrusted by the people, is the government. Locke thus answers how governments emerge. Let's retell Locke's narrative. Initially, all were equal, enjoying self-governance freedom, living happily guided by natural law. But enforcing natural law became problematic. To avoid being both player and referee, people consented to delegate enforcement power through a social contract to a neutral arbitrator. Thus, government emerged, ending the stateless condition. However, transitioning from anarchy to government is one thing. Defining governmental power's scope is another. The two treatises next examines the boundaries of governmental or public power. Both Filmer and Hobbes, Locke's opponents, argued governments should maximize control, with citizens surrendering extensive rights for societal stability. But Locke believed governmental power must be limited, severely limited. Government shouldn't even interfere with property. It should act nearly as a night watchman, guarding wealth. Because government's ultimate purpose is protecting private property. How did Locke reach this radical conclusion? Because private property existed in the state of nature, predating governments, making it beyond governmental reach. Why would private property exist in the state of nature? Here we encounter another famous theory in the two treatises: the origin of private property. Just as no one is born to be ruled, natural resources, river water, tree fruits, aren't inherently private property. Locke viewed them as God's communal gifts for humanity's sustenance, and only one's own body was inherently private property from the beginning. So how did other private property originate? Locke argued, through human labor, when something's natural state is altered by your work, then that thing becomes an extension of your body, your private property. For example, river water flows freely. Thirsty people can bend down to drink anytime. But if you scoop water into a bottle, it's different, even though the water's taste and nutrients remain unchanged. Though you're just transporting water, that small act makes the bottled water your private property. No one else can drink from your bottle without consent. Conversely, consider this. If unused land lies near your home, but you just pass by daily, it remains communal. But if Jean cultivates it, adding labor and enhancing its value, he can fence it off as his private property. Property originates from labor, Locke's famous theory of ownership. Of course, Locke also set limits. Take only what you can reasonably use. Say Jean greedily picks apples but lets them rot uneaten. That exceeds private property's legitimate scope. Property must be utilized. Hoarding without use or wasting it invalidates ownership claims. In summary, creating government only transfers enforcement rights, not property itself. Besides, property predates government in the state of nature. Thus, Locke declared, governments can't arbitrarily touch citizens' property. That's the limit of power. Now we've clarified governmental power's boundaries. To fully discuss government, one question remains: how should governmental power be structured? Locke believed the key lies in balancing legislative, executive, and federative powers. First, let's examine legislative power. As mentioned, civil society protects better than the state of nature, partly because written laws are clearer than intangible natural law. Thus, upon entering civil society, legislation becomes the paramount task. So everyone delegates legislative power to representatives, forming the legislative body. This lawmaking authority becomes the supreme power, binding all citizens equally without exception. As the highest authority, Can the legislature make laws arbitrarily? Of course not. Remember, it exists to protect property. Thus, legislative power has four limits. First, laws must be publicly announced, no backroom deals, and apply equally to everyone. Second, while laws demand universal obedience, their sole purpose must be public welfare, nothing else. Third, flowing from the second, legislatures can't seize property without consent, since property protection is why laws exist. Finally, legislatures, born from public mandate, can't transfer legislative power without people's approval. With laws established, we turn to enforcement. While crucial, legislatures don't need constant lawmaking. After enacting laws, they become dormant. But should they enforce them too? The answer is no. We must guard against human weakness. If rulemakers also enforce, they might lower standards to exempt themselves, or manipulate laws to favor private interests during creation.
Thus, Locke insisted on separating enforcement power, the executive, from legislation.
The executive branch impacts daily life more than the legislature. This covers internal power distribution. But internationally, still lacking universal laws, nations exist in a state of nature, exposing property to external threats. Hence, people authorize the state to handle national defense. For instance, signing treaties with other nations to form alliances or waging war against aggressors. This power is federative power. Theoretically, federative and executive powers differ, but practically, they're often held by the same people, because both require backing by coercive institutions. Today, most nations assign executive power to institutions like the State Council, while foreign ministries handling federative power report to them. Yet legislative power remains supreme. The ideal state, as Locke envisioned, features clear separation between legislative and executive powers, with distinct branches functioning smoothly. But if power distribution fails, civil society could become worse than the state of nature. The worst outcome is governmental dissolution. So what causes governmental collapse? Locke cites three reasons. First, foreign invasion, where conquerors overthrow the government. Second, dissolution of the legislature also means governmental collapse. Why would legislatures dissolve? Often due to rulers' tyranny, executives replacing laws with arbitrary decrees. This renders legislatures useless, either bypassed or failing to enforce laws. Third, legislatures themselves malfunction by violating property rights, betraying public trust and the social contract's purpose. Thus, the state ceases to exist. After collapse, people don't revert to nature but retain the right to establish a new government.
Here, Locke completes his analysis, from governmental origin to demise.
Finally, let's recap the two treatises' core arguments. Locke asserts, government-citizen relations differ fundamentally from parent-child or master-slave dynamics. Parental authority prioritizes children's welfare, not parental gain. Moreover, it's temporary, ending when children mature and reason independently. As for a master's rights over slaves, they're highly authoritarian. Now, the master can do anything, holding absolute control over slaves' lives and property, with no constraints or time limits. Government's authority over citizens arises from delegation solely to protect private property. Beyond that, it can't meddle in anything else. If governments overstep, citizens can, in extreme cases, rebuild one that safeguards their interests. Having covered the original content of the two treatises, let's explore this classic work's three major contributions. First, it timely summarized the political achievements of the English Revolution, and its theories challenged long-standing monarchical traditions, utterly groundbreaking for contemporary readers. When Locke wrote this, Britain was in revolutionary turmoil. Thus, it's clear the book defended the British people's revolution. King Charles I forcibly dissolved Parliament and imposed taxes, exceeding governmental boundaries. This meant governmental dissolution, making the people's revolution just. After the Glorious Revolution, Britain's governance transformed. The Bill of Rights empowered Parliament, restricted royal taxation, and secured property rights. To Locke, this government gained legitimacy and stability. Indeed, Britain's political structure remains largely unchanged since the late 17th century. Second, it became the theoretical cornerstone of modern democratic governments. Especially during the 18th century bourgeois revolutions, it played a massive role. A prime example, the 1776 American Revolutionary War. One trigger was the British king taxing colonial property, essentially plundering it. The American Revolution embodied people discarding an overreaching government to build a rights-protecting one. Locke's doctrines became key ideological weapons: natural rights, equality, inviolable property, all originating from Locke, were enshrined in the 1776 Declaration of Independence. Beyond that, the design of separation of powers and checks and balances in America's founding fundamentally puts Locke's limited government ideas into practice. Finally, there's a third major impact of the two treatises.
Third, Locke's theory on the origin of private property became an inspiration for new intellectual currents in the 19th century.
Since its publication, the two treatises has often been seen as the defining theory of modern democratic politics. But by the 19th century, it found new applications. In the German ideology, Marx criticized the capitalist economic system for exploiting people, especially by alienating the proletariat through labor. This entire critique is rooted in the labor theory of value proposed in Locke's two treatises. Though Locke, as a mentor of the bourgeois revolution, couldn't align with Marx, it's undeniable that his analysis of human labor in the two treatises inspired Marx's own theories. In summary, the two treatises bears distinct marks of its era. It guided the democratic transformation of Western society and shaped world history. On the other hand, the book's theories are deeply penetrating. Despite changing times, they keep providing endless inspiration for thinkers, making it an indispensable classic today. All right, that wraps up our interpretation of the two treatises. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.